The Firefly is the most popular boat for team racing in the UK. Last time we looked at how we could rig our Firefly ready to go team racing, and this time we're going to take a look at some sail settings and how we can set our boat up to be able to go fast and win races. Thankfully, the Firefly is a pretty simple boat. It's got pretty simple sail settings, and that means that this is not as hard as it is compared with some other boats. But we're going to rig this up, we're going to get it ready to go, and then we're going to take a look at those sail settings. Our first sail setting to consider is one which we've already thought about when we're rigging. And so I'm going to re-emphasize a point from my last video, which is that when we're pulling up the main halyard, we want to take the boom off the gooseneck, pull the main all the way up to the top, and then pull the boom back down onto the gooseneck. And that's going to help us get some luff tension. This is particularly important in team racing Fireflies because we're often going to be using old sails that have been used for a number of years and they're going to be quite baggy, and if we want to have any tension in our luff, we're going to need to use that halyard and really get it all the way up and then stretch the sail back down. The one exception to that is if you've got a really light wind day and you're using particularly new sails, then sometimes if you do that you're going to end up with a nasty crease like bulge along the front of your sail, and that's not very good. So if you notice that, if it's super light and if you've got newer sails, then you may end up with that. But in general, for the halyard tension, we want pretty much as possible if it's an old sail. In stronger breeze, we may sometimes want to use a Cunningham to add even more tension to the luff, and you can do that by just using a piece of scrap rope and attach it to this D-ring here. Goes up through this eye and then back down, and either back onto the D-ring for a really strong hold point, or you can put it through this cleat here if you want it to be adjustable. It's got to be pretty damn windy to be using a Cunningham in a Firefly, and my general advice would be to hike harder. If you're team racing, you'll also switch into cut down sails at some point, which are sails which have a smaller sail area that take the top of the sail off, and so you'll depower it using a cut down. It's like a reefed sail instead of using a Cunningham first, probably. So it needs to be really, really windy to use one, which is why most boats don't even bother to rig one on there. Our second sail setting, in a similar vein, is the Outhaul, which obviously comes out here, and you can see it attaches onto the end of the main over there. Fireflies, as we said before, often have these baggy sails. They've got this really big, deep foot, and so we want to take out quite a lot of that, or it's going to be hard for us to point. It's not going to generate nice flow of the sails. So in general, with most Fireflies, and particularly again if you're using older sails, you're going to want to pull on pretty much as much outhaul as you can. You want near to max outhaul. You will notice that along the foot of the sail we get this crease, which obviously in a different boat you might be quite worried about that. Don't worry about that. That's actually just a side effect of taking as much of that bulge out the bottom of the sail as we can. You can even see, even with that on, it's still a deep sail, and we're gonna have plenty of power. Our next sail setting to think about is kicker. So the kicker can be adjusted from two places in a standard setup team racing Firefly, which is you're gonna have one on each side of the cockpit, and these both link to the kicker here. You can sail a Firefly without very much kicker. Generally, if you're pulling, you're never going to be in a situation where you're really going to be cranking it on, and quite a lot in very light winds you're going to want as little as possible on. Now a big caveat to that is if you have no kicker on, when you're jiving, your boom can often come off. So what we'll generally look to do, if we want our boom to not come off, if we're in really light wind modes but we want as little kicker as possible, is just pull your main all the way in, and you want your kicker to be just a bit floppy, like about that, and then cleat it off. So there's a little bit of flop in there, so when you're going upwind there's nothing on it even when you're playing it, so you've got a few inches of play without any kicker, but when you go for your jibes there's still some kicker on so that your boom doesn't fall off. As with any dinghy, we might also use our kicker in order to depower upwind when it's getting a bit stronger. So in medium winds, we're not going to want that kicker to be loose like we just said before. We might pull a little bit more on, which is going to help us bend the mast and flatten the sail off, which is going to reduce a bit of our power. As it gets into the strong, when we're looking at kind of 20 knots plus, we're going to pull even more on. In general, what I look for me in kind of medium winds, so around 15 knots, is that I want, when I'm at max main sheet, the kicker isn't doing anything. When I'm right at max, so maybe about there right now, or there, or it's just not doing anything when I'm right at max, but when I want to depower, the kicker comes on. And then when I'm in really strong winds, when it's kind of 20 plus knots, then I'll go to kind of max, and I want the kicker on plus a little bit at max, which is going to help me, flatten that mainsail out and depower the boat. As we think about how we want our sail looking when we bear away, we're also going to need to still be thinking about kicker. So we want enough kicker on that when we bear away at a windward mark, that the top of our sail isn't going to completely twist out and we're going to kill all of our speed. So we want a little bit of kicker on, and downwind we want it, just stopping that boom from coming off and also stopping our boom from skying, which is going to spill loads of power because we're going to have a super twisty main. So instead, we just want just enough on. Now, often when we're team racing, we won't have time to adjust our kick around the course, especially when we've got mark trips going on, when it's really busy. So that's why generally I would err on the side of too little kicker rather than too much, because then you're going to be better off around most of the course, even if you're a little bit slower upwind. And generally, you can always make up for less kicker by working a bit harder in the boat. So generally, if you have to choose, go for less than you think. One of our most important settings on the Firefly is going to be our jib halyard tension, or our rig tension. And this is going to control where our mast rake is at, and it's going to control a lot about how our leech looks, and also what our jib shape looks like. So it's a really important setting. And you can see the difference it makes from when I have the minimum rig tension compared with the maximum rig tension. And it really changes where the boom is, changes how the whole mast looks, how the sail shape looks. So it's a really important setting. Our minimum rig tension, and this is really important, is going to be the tension at which all the tension sits on the jib halyard still. So a lot of this is going to be dictated by how tight the forestay is, and you'll often find if you're hopping into a boat for a team racing event that the forestay can be a little bit too tight. And if you don't have enough time to change it, you still want to make sure you've got enough rig tension on, so when you're going upwind on a close-hauled course, you've still got all of that tension on your jib and not on your forestay. So when we have more rig tension in the Firefly, that's going to help to straighten out our mast. We've got that top of the jib halyard pulling the mast forwards there, straightening it out, and we've also got our boom that's higher, and that's going to result in having a baggier, deeper sail, which is going to help us get a bit more power in light breeze. Whereas, when it gets stronger, if we rake our mast back, and we have this allow greater mast bend, that's going to help us flatten our sail off and depower the boat. So in a Firefly, we're thinking a little bit more rig tension on when it's light and let it off when it's a bit windier. And that's particularly true if you have to switch to cut down sails from your full sails, because when you've got a cut down sail on, that's going to shift your centre of effort forwards, because you've got an imbalance in terms of power between your main and your jib. Now the boat won't feel as nice. And by raking the mast back, you're going to move the centre of effort further backwards again, which is going to make the rudder a lot more balanced, make it easier to steer and induce less rudder drag from your steering. And that important jib halyard tension, rig tension control is right here. So it comes out of that centre console. If you're ever unsure of how much rig tension to use, there's a pretty easy test to get it about right, which is that in medium winds, you're looking for that rig tension to be about the length of your forearm plus a fist. So when the main is fully sheeted in. So this is not quite enough rig tension, and then I can pull on a little bit more, and then there, I think that's going to be about right for that test, yeah. So you can work off that as a rough rule of thumb, and then adjust that depending on your racing needs and whether you feel overpowered or underpowered in your boat. Our final and most important rig settings in a Firefly are, of course, our jib sheet tension and our main sheet tension. And these are really going to have the biggest effect on what our sail shape looks like. Because we've got so few tensions in the Firefly, we're going to be able to affect so much of the sail shape just with these controls. So an important point with this is that we've got a big jib on a Firefly. It's a big jib and it's got a big overlap with the main, which means that one of the really important things we always need to think about is the slot. So we need to know whether our slot is open or closed. And if we've ever got a mismatch between where our jib and our main is, we're probably going to close that slot up a bit too much. Or we're going to leave it wide open if we've got our jib flapping. So we're always thinking in this dynamic about how we can keep the flow over both of those sails and keep that slot nicely open. For our jib, we'll probably have a couple of sets of telltales, and for the most part, the crew can trim the jib just by looking at this bottom telltale, sometimes glancing up at the top telltale to make sure they're both flying. When they're going upwind, the crew is going to be pulling that jib all the way in, and the helm will be steering off the telltales. But it's important, particularly upwind in the light, that the crew is able to ease the jib just a little bit. And when I say a little bit, I mean literally like an inch or two through the block. So that's going to have a big effect on this jib because, as I said, we've got less settings. And if you ease a little bit through the block, that's going to open that top corner right out. So particularly when it's light, that's going to be really important to stop the boat from stalling out. So we're going to use a little bit of sheet off in the light, particularly as we're exiting maneuvers. There's so little wind today that it's really hard to properly show what our leech profile is going to look like with our main sheet, but we can have a lot of control over how our profile looks with the main sheet. So first of all, as we pull that main on, you can hopefully there see our leech start to close up, but I think it's already pretty hooked, to be honest, and it's quite hard to show with the light winds, but we can play that. We have a lot of control over the sail just with the main, and we're going to also, particularly when we're team racing, be looking for lots of shifts, especially on these small gravel pits, on these small reservoirs. We're always going to need to be playing the main. Should never be static. We can work this really hard to always be looking to take more power and to hike really hard to keep our boat flat and moving fast. Especially if you're a bit newer to sailing, it's important to remember those important fundamentals with the main sheet, which is just that when we're going upwind, a little bit can actually do quite a lot for reducing power. So as we let out a little bit of main, at first the boom isn't going to move, other than the boom's not going to move out, it's going to move up. So you're going to open our top corner, induce some twist in the main, which is going to allow our power to spill out at the top of the main, which is going to help us keep the boat flat. So just remember, with the main and the jib, a little bit goes a long way. And when you're thinking about playing these sails, and in fact, especially in the light, but whenever you're playing these sails, you can be thinking in terms of inches rather than in terms of armfuls. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this helpful. Please leave any questions you have in the comments below and I'll answer any of them. It's been really useful for me too. A lot of this stuff we get really used to thinking about just in terms of what we know, what we feel in the boat, what we know works, rather than actually thinking about why it works. So for those who are more experienced, definitely try and take a moment next time you're sailing to think about why what you're doing does what it does, which is something I know for me is a big learning point and something I often need to start thinking back to, because when we're sailing boats that we're used to, it can be very easy to slip into those habits of just doing kind of what we know works just because we know it works. So thanks for watching. Please consider subscribing and look forward to seeing you in the next one.